That night, as Laura drifted off to sleep, a terrible dream haunted her. She found herself in a dense forest, tied to a bamboo tree, with a fearsome masquerade standing before her. His voice sent shivers down her spine, and she struggled against her bonds until she woke up from her sleep. In the bustling city of Warri, there lived a happy couple named Mr. Uche and Mrs. Laura. Their love was like a bright light shining in the night sky. But not all was as it seemed in their cozy home. Just 2 months after their beautiful wedding, Laura started noticing strange things about her husband. He would sneak around the house, whispering on the phone late at night, and disappearing for hours without explanation. Laura's heart filled with worry as she wondered what secrets her husband was hiding. One sunny afternoon, Laura's worry turned into joy when she discovered she was going to have a baby. She rushed to the hospital for a checkup, her heart pounding with excitement. After a series of tests, the doctor confirmed that wonderful news. Laura indeed was pregnant. Unable to contain her happiness, Laura hurried home to share the news with her husband. But when she arrived, she found Mr. Uche already there, a strange look on his face. She asked him why he was home so early, but he just shrugged and mumbled something about finishing work early. Suspicion nagged at Laura's mind, but she brushed it aside, eager to share her joy with her husband. As she revealed the news of her pregnancy, she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't as happy as she had hoped. But she dismissed her doubts, thinking perhaps he was just overwhelmed. That night, as Laura drifted off to sleep, a terrible dream haunted her. She found herself in a dense forest, tied to a bamboo tree, with a fearsome masquerade standing before her. His voice sent shivers down her spine, and she struggled against her bonds until she woke up from her sleep. Beside her, Mr. Uche was watching her, his expression unreadable. She recounted her nightmare to him, hoping for comfort, but he merely brushed it off as a silly dream. Little did Laura know, her nightmare held a terrible truth. Her husband, Mr. Uche, was not the kind and loving husband she believed him to be. He was a ritualist, consumed by greed and darkness, and in his twisted mind, he had already decided the fate of their unborn child. As the night stretched on, secrets hung in the air like a thick fog waiting to be revealed. But for now, Laura slept on, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but the darkness in Mr. Uche's heart remained, and as the days passed, his sinister plans began to take shape, casting a shadow over their once happy home. As the days passed, Mrs. Laura's heart still ached from the loss of her unborn child. Each night, she would toss and turn, haunted by nightmares that refused to let her rest. But amidst her grief, a seed of suspicion began to take root in her mind. One fateful night, Mrs. Laura awoke to a sharp pain in her abdomen. Panic surged through her as she realized she was bleeding. She called out for her husband, but he was nowhere to be found. When he finally appeared, his demeanor calm, he hurried her to the hospital. The doctor's words cut like a knife. She had suffered another miscarriage. Mrs. Laura's world crumbled around her as she wept for the child she would never hold in her arms. Her husband tried to offer words of comfort, but they fell on deaf ears. The grief was raw, too consuming, and as she lay in the hospital bed, a sense of unease settled over her like a dark cloud. When Mrs. Laura was discharged and returned home, the weight of her loss hung heavy in the air. She tried to resume her daily routine, but her husband's mysterious behavior gnawed at her like a persistent itch. Unable to bear the burden alone any longer, Mrs. Laura turned to her old friend Linda for help. With determination in her heart, she confided in Linda, laying bare her suspicions about her husband's secret. Linda listened with a mix of shock and concern, her brow furrowing as she processed the troubling information. Together, they hatched a plan to uncover the truth once and for all. The following Saturday, as Mr. Uche sat down for breakfast, Mrs. Laura carefully spiked his tea with the substance Linda had provided. As he drifted off to sleep, she sprang into action, scouring every inch of their home for clues. She tried as she might. Mrs. Laura found nothing that could explain her husband's strange behavior. As the hours ticked by, frustration threatened to overwhelm her. Where was the key to unlocking the truth? Just as she was about to give up hope, Mr. Uche stirred from his slumber. Mrs. Laura's heart raced as she scrambled to come up with an excuse for her snooping. To her relief, he seemed oblivious to her actions, accepting her flimsy explanation without question. But as he left the room, Mrs. Laura's eyes fell upon something she hadn't noticed before. A laptop tucked away in a corner of the room. Her pulse quickened as she realized that this could be the key to unraveling the mystery once and for all. With determination burning bright in her eyes, Mrs. Laura vowed to uncover the secrets hidden within her husband's laptop, no matter the cost. With her heart pounding in her chest, Mrs. Laura watched as her husband, Mr. Uche, left the room, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the laptop held the answers she had been searching for. As Mr. Uche disappeared from view, Mrs. Laura's hands trembled as she reached for the laptop. With bated breath, she flipped it open, her eyes scanning the screen for any sign of the secrets her husband had been hiding. But as she clicked through the files and folders, her heart sank. There was nothing, no incriminating evidence, no hidden messages, just mundane documents and work-related emails. Disappointment threatened to overwhelm her as she realized that her plan had failed. Had she been wrong about her husband all along? Was there a rational explanation for his strange behavior? Lost in her thoughts, Mrs. Laura barely noticed as Mr. Uche returned to the room. His expression was unreadable as he watched her, his eyes flickering over to the open laptop. "What are you doing with my laptop?" he asked, his voice very calm. Mrs. Laura's heart raced as she struggled to come up with a possible explanation. She had to tread carefully. One wrong move could shatter the fragile peace between them. I was just checking something," she stammered, her mind racing for an excuse. "I wanted to see if there was any picture of us." Mr. Uche's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press the issue further. Instead, he simply nodded and walked away, leaving Mrs. Laura alone with her thoughts once more. As she stared at the laptop screen, a sense of defeat washed over her. She had hoped that uncovering her husband's secret would bring her the answers she so desperately sought. But now, all she felt was emptiness. As she stared at the laptop screen, a sense of defeat washed over her. She had hoped that uncovering her husband's secret would bring her the answers she so desperately sought. But now, all she felt was emptiness. But just as she was about to close the laptop, something caught her eyes. A folder tucked away in the corner of the screen, labeled "Private." With a surge of hope, Mrs. Laura clicked on the folder, her heart pounding in anticipation. As she scrolled through the files within, her breath caught in her throat. There, hidden among the mundane documents, were pictures of her husband, Mr. Uche, engaged in rituals. She couldn't begin to understand. His face was twisted in a mask of malice as he performed unspeakable acts, his hands stained with blood. Tears filled Mrs. Laura's eyes as she realized the truth. Her husband was not the man she thought he was. He was a monster, consumed by darkness and driven by greed. But as the shock began to fade, a fire ignited within her, a fire fueled by anger and determination. She may have failed to uncover the truth before, but now she knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, Mrs. Laura closed the laptop, her mind already racing with plans for what lay ahead. She may have been blindfolded by her husband's deceit, but she refused to let him destroy her life any further. As Mrs. Laura prepared for work on Monday, she planned to call her friend Linda and share the outcome of their failed attempt to uncover Mrs. Uche's secret. However, when she tried to reach Linda on the phone, there was no answer. Worried, Mrs. Laura decided to visit her friend's house. Upon arriving, Mrs. Laura was met with a horrifying sight. Linda had been strangled in her own home. Shock and grief overwhelmed Mrs. Laura as she realized that her only confidant had been killed. She couldn't fathom who wanted to harm Linda, as she had never mentioned any enemies. For weeks, Mrs. Laura struggled to focus on anything. The death of Linda weighed heavily on her mind, casting a shadow over her every thought. Amidst her mourning, Mrs. Laura made a startling discovery. She was pregnant again. Instead of feeling joy, fear gripped her heart as memories of past events flooded her mind. She hadn't even confided in her own mother about the turmoil in her household. The following day, on her way to work, Mrs. Laura decided to confide in her mother. She poured out her heart, recounting all that had been happening in her home. Her mother listened patiently and advised her to turn to God for help, emphasizing that only God could provide true assistance. They prayed together over the phone, and Mrs. Laura realized that she had neglected her faith, failing to pray or attend church services. Determined to seek solace and guidance, Mrs. Laura embarked on a 3-day fasting. During this time, she fervently prayed, pouring out her worries and fears to God. On the 3rd day of her fast, after a particularly intense prayer session, she fell asleep and experienced a chilling nightmare. In her dream, she saw the same creature she had encountered during her miscarriage, mercilessly attacking Linda. Mrs. Laura watched in horror as her friend cried out for help, but before she could reach them, the creature vanished with Linda. Trembling, Mrs. Laura awoke to find Mr. Uche standing beside her. So she pretended everything was alright, but her husband sensed something was amiss and he asked if she was okay. Mrs. Laura reassured him and quickly left the room, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. And so the mystery deepened, leaving Mrs. Laura grappling with fear and suspicion, unsure of who to trust or where to turn to for help. Laura went through her day at work in a daze, her mind consumed by the mysterious voice of the creature from her nightmares. She struggled to concentrate on her work, her thoughts swelling with fear and confusion. When she finally returned home, she found her husband waiting for her, which was unusual. He greeted her with excitement, telling her he had good news. With a beaming smile, he handed her the keys to a brand new SUV, the latest model. Laura was stunned by the extravagant gift, but her husband wasn't done yet. He had another surprise in store. He then took her to a newly built mansion in the city, revealing that it was their new home. Laura couldn't contain her joy, hugging her husband tightly as she marveled at the grandeur of their new abode. He pointed out her new car, and she eagerly ran to explore it, tapping the horn button with glee. As they entered the house, Laura was captivated by the luxurious decor. Every room was well furnished, and she felt like she was living in a dream. Her worries seemed to melt away in the face of such opulence, and she couldn't help but giggle like a child. But her husband's next words brought her back to reality. He instructed her not to enter a particular room upstairs under any circumstances. Laura nodded obediently, but inside she was filled with questions. Why was she forbidden from entering the room? What secrets lay within its walls? Unknown to Laura, her husband was already aware of her pregnancy. Plans were underway among his occultic members to sacrifice the unborn child, just as they had done with their previous babies. It was the blood of their first child and the second that had paved way for their newfound wealth and luxury. Lost in a whirlwind of emotions, Laura struggled to shake off the air feelings that lingered in the back of her mind. Despite the grandeur of their new home and the excitement of her husband's surprises, a sense of unease gnawed at her inside. As she wandered through the opulent rooms of their mansion, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The forbidden room upstairs loomed in her thoughts like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over her newfound happiness. But as her husband showered her with gifts and affection, Laura pushed aside her doubts, desperate to cling to the illusion of happiness he had woven around her. With each passing moment, she buried her fear deeper and deeper, clinging to the hope that everything would be alright. Days turned into weeks, and Laura found herself settling into their new life with a sense of cautious optimism. The mansion became her sanctuary, a fortress of luxury and comfort that shielded her from the harsh realities of the world outside. Beneath the surface, a storm raged, a storm of secrets and lies that threatened to tear apart the fragile facade of happiness Laura had built around herself. Unknown to her, her husband's motives were far from pure, and the darkness that lurked within their home grew ever stronger with each passing day. Meanwhile, Laura's pregnancy progressed, a beacon of hope amidst the shadows that haunted her every step. But as her due date drew nearer, a sense of foreboding settled over her like a heavy shroud, whispering of dangers yet to come. One fateful night, as Laura lay awake in bed, her thoughts consumed by the mysteries that surrounded her, she heard a faint sound echoing through the halls of their mansion. Curiosity piqued. She rose from bed and followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the forbidden room upstairs, the sound grew louder, echoing off the walls with an air intensity. With trembling hands, Laura reached for the door, her fingers hovering just inches from the handle. But before she could summon the courage to open it, her husband's voice cut through the silence like a knife, sending a shiver down her spine. Startled, Laura turned to see him standing behind her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of suspicion. Caught off guard, Laura stammered for an explanation, her mind racing for a possible excuse. But as she met her husband's gaze, she saw something flicker in his eyes, something dark and sinister that sent a chill down her spine. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Laura realized that her husband was hiding something, something terrible that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Night after night, Laura knelt in prayer, seeking solace and protection in the embrace of her faith. But her husband's disapproval hung heavy in the air, casting a shadow over her every plea for divine intervention. One evening, as Laura poured out her heart in prayer, Mr. Uche's voice cut through the silence like a blade, his words dripping with disdain. He scolded her for disturbing the peace of their home, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. But Laura refused to be silenced, her resolve unshaken by her husband's scorn. With courage in her heart, she defended the power of prayer, adamant in her belief that God would protect her from whatever dangers lurked in the darkness. Undeterred by her husband's disapproval, Laura proposed they attend church services together, hoping to find solace and strength in the company of fellow believers. But Mr. Uche's response was swift and cold. He forbade her from ever bringing up such discussion again. His words a chilling reminder of the power he wielded over her. As the days turned into weeks, Laura couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her like a heavy fog. Each night, as the clock struck midnight, Mr. Uche would slip from their bedroom, his movements shrouded in mystery. At first, Laura dismissed the late night wanderings as harmless, assuming he was simply seeking solitude or relaxation. But as the pattern continued, her curiosity grew, gnawing at her inside until she could bear it no longer. One fateful night, feigning sleep, Laura waited until Mr. Uche left their bedroom before silently slipping from bed and trailing after him. With each step, her heart pounded in her chest, anticipation mingling with fear as she approached the forbidden room he had warned her never to enter. With trembling hands, Laura pushed open the door and stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The room was bathed in an air glow, strange symbols etched into the walls, and a very bad scent hung heavy in the air. As she crept further into the room, her eyes widened in astonishment at what she saw. Her husband, surrounded by a group of shadowy figures, their faces hidden beneath hoods, as they chanted in a language she couldn't understand. In that moment, Laura realized the truth. Her husband was involved in something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. And as she watched in horror, a cold chill swept through her veins, sending shivers down her spine. But despite the fear that threatened to consume her, Laura's resolve remained unbroken. With determination burning bright in her heart, she vowed to uncover the secrets behind her husband's backdealing, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, Laura slipped silently from the forbidden room, her mind racing with plans for what lay ahead. As days passed, the weight of secrecy and danger bore down heavily on the shoulders of Mr. Uche and Mrs. Laura. Each moment was fraught with tension and uncertainty, the looming threat of danger casting a long shadow over their lives. For Mrs. Laura, the burden was especially heavy, her delicate condition only serving to amplify the whispers of suspicion that followed her every move. Everywhere she turned, she felt the eyes of judgment upon her, their accusing gazes fueling her growing sense of unease. Seeking solace in the comforting embrace of the church, Mrs. Laura poured out her heart in prayer, her tears mingling with the echoes of her desperate pleas for protection. But even amidst the sanctuary of the church walls, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. As she emerged from the church, her heart heavy with fear, a young girl approached her, her words a chilling warning that sent shivers down Mrs. Laura's spine. The girl's message echoed in her mind as she made her way home, the weight of its implications pressing down on her with crushing forces. The girl's words sent shivers down Mrs. Laura's spine. "Ma'am, please be careful and vigilant. Hold on to God tightly, because evil is lurking around your home. Always put your husband in your prayers, because something is cooking around him," the girl warned before disappearing into the night. But as she crossed the threshold of her home, the air thick with tension, Mrs. Laura's fears were met with a cold reception from her husband. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, his accusatory gaze piercing through her like a knife, demanding to know why she had returned home late. Mr. Uche's voice was laced with menace, her words a stark reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the facade of their seemingly happy home. Trembling with fear, Mrs. Laura scrambled to concoct a believable lie, her words trembling over one another in her haste to make her husband's growing anger calm down. As he stormed out of the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts, Mrs. Laura's mind raced with fear and uncertainty. What was her husband hiding? And more importantly, what danger lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike when least expected? With each passing moment, the web of secrets and lies grew ever tighter around Mrs. Laura, threatening to suffocate her beneath its weight. But amidst the darkness, a flicker of hope remained, a determination to uncover the truth and protect her unborn child from whatever darkness lay ahead. That night, as Mrs. Laura drifted into a fitful sleep, she found herself once again trapped in the clutches of a haunting nightmare. The dense forest loomed around her, and the menacing creature stood before her, its mask concealing its true identity. But this time, Mrs. Laura's resolve burned brighter than ever before. With every fiber of her being, she fought against the darkness, determined to uncover the truth hidden beneath the mask. And as the mask fell away, revealing her husband's face, Mrs. Laura gasped in disbelief, her heart heavy with betrayal. As she awoke in a cold sweat, trembling with fear and confusion, Mrs. Laura found herself alone in the darkness of their bedroom. The echoes of her nightmare lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of the secrets that lurked within the shadows. When Mr. Uche returned home later that night, he found Mrs. Laura lost in thought, her troubled expression betraying the turmoil raging within her. Concerned, he approached her, his voice gentle as he inquired about her well-being. Mrs. Laura hesitated, unsure whether to share the truth of the nightmare with her husband, but as she met his gaze and felt a pang of doubt, could she trust him with the depth of her fears? In the end, Mrs. Laura chose to confide in him, her words tumbling out in a rush as she recounted the horrors of her dream. But to her surprise, Mr. Uche brushed off her concerns, offering her a cup of water to soothe her nerves. Despite her husband's reassurances, Mrs. Laura couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at her inside. With a heavy heart, she pushed aside her suspicions, choosing to dismiss her fears for the sake of their fragile peace. The next day, determined to prioritize her health and the well-being of her unborn child, Mrs. Laura sought medical advice at the hospital. After a series of tests, the doctor delivered unexpected news. She was 2 months pregnant. Feeling both relieved and apprehensive, Mrs. Laura pleaded with the doctor to keep her pregnancy a secret from her husband. Her reasons known only to herself. Concerned about her health, the doctor prescribed medication and advised her to take better care of herself. Leaving the hospital with a heavy heart, Mrs. Laura resolved to follow the doctor's orders, determined to protect her unborn baby at all costs. Laura's heart pounded with dread as she entered her home, her senses on high alert. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air, casting a dark shadow over her every step. But as she stepped inside, her husband's unexpected display of affection caught her off guard. Surrounded by scattered rose petals and a beautifully set dining table, Laura couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope amidst the turmoil that had engulfed their lives. Yet, beneath the facade of love and generosity, Laura's instincts screamed a warning. She couldn't ignore the secrets that lurked beneath the surface. "Sweetie, please come have a seat. Today I'm giving you a special treat to help you relax after everything that's happened. I want to pamper you like the princess that you are." Mr. Uche's words rang out, his smile filled with sincerity. Grateful for her husband's efforts, Laura hesitated, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. "Thank you, honey. Everything looks wonderful, but I'm not hungry. I already ate something on my way home," she replied, offering him a tight hug before retreating upstairs. In the solitude of their home, Laura couldn't shake off the unease that gnawed at her heart. She knew she was avoiding her husband and whatever surprises he had planned, but she couldn't bring herself to trust him fully. Enraged by Laura's rejection, Mr. Uche stormed into their room, his anger boiling over. "Laura, what's gotten into you? Why did you walk out on me like that? Don't you appreciate anything I do for you?" he shouted, his frustration evident. Before Laura could respond, she felt the sting of his hand against her cheek, followed by a harsh kick to her stomach. Overwhelmed by pain and shock, she collapsed to the ground, her words spinning out of control. The next thing she knew, Laura woke up in the hospital bed, her body aching and her heart heavy with sorrow. Her husband stood beside her, his expression filled with concern and regret. As the doctor entered the room, Laura's heart clenched with fear. She mustered the courage to ask about her baby, her voice trembling with grief. The doctor's words were like a dagger through her heart. Her baby was gone. Tears streamed down Laura's face as she wailed in agony, cursing her husband for his actions. Despite his attempts to console her, she pushed him away, consumed by her sorrow and betrayal. Exhausted from her emotional turmoil, Laura drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams haunted by visions of lost child and the shattered remains of her once happy marriage. A week had passed since Laura's discharge from the hospital, yet the weight of her grief still hung heavy in the air. Seeking solace, she retreated to the guest room, locking herself away from the world. Each night, tears stained her pillow as she cried herself to sleep, the darkness of her solitude enveloping her like a shroud. Despite Mr. Uche's attempts to comfort her, knocking on the door and pleading for her to let him in, Laura remained steadfast in her isolation. 2 weeks later, a strange transformation overcame Laura. Emerging from her seclusion, she became a very different person. Mr. Uche, taken aback by her sudden change in demeanor, couldn't help but wonder what had transpired during her time alone. Laura greeted him warmly before immersing herself in the household chores and preparing for work. As she left for the day, Mr. Uche couldn't shake off his curiosity about her newfound energy, resolving to tread carefully around her from then on. After work, Laura made a detour to the church, seeking solace and guidance from God. Pouring out her heart in prayer, she apologized for doubting his love and power. Finding comfort in worship, she returned home, feeling lighter and more at peace. Upon her arrival, Laura greeted her husband before retreating to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Despite Mr. Uche's reluctance to eat, Laura reassured him by tasting the food herself, easing his suspicions. However, when she broached the topic of hiring a maid to help with household chores, Mr. Uche refused, insisting that they didn't need any outsiders interfering in their affairs. Disappointed but undeterred, Laura cleared the table and retreated upstairs to study, determined to find a solution to her exhaustion. Later that day, Laura received a troubling call from her mother, who shared a disturbing dream she had. Convinced that her daughter's life was in danger, her mother proposed a 7-day fast and prayer session to ward off the looming threat. Laura was overcome with fear and uncertainty, wondering why such misfortune had befallen her. Laura and her mother embarked on a journey of fasting and prayer, seeking God's intervention in their lives. Despite her husband's warnings, Laura remained steadfast in her faith, praying fervently at work and in the church. One day, during her prayer session at the church, the pastor approached her and delivered a message of hope and victory. Encouraged by his words, Laura returned home feeling strengthened in her faith. That night, Laura had a powerful dream. She found herself once again in the mysterious forest, facing the creature with her husband's face. In a fierce battle, Laura overcame the creature, reclaiming her strength and courage. When she awoke, she felt a newfound sense of empowerment and gratitude toward God for his protection. Shortly after, Mr. Uche informed Laura of his sudden business trip, leaving her puzzled by his anxious demeanor. Despite her attempts to inquire further, he remained tight-lipped and hurried off, leaving Laura to ponder the reason behind his departure. During her evening prayers, Laura felt a prompting to investigate the forbidden room in their house. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and discovered a horrifying sight. The room was adorned with sinister decorations, including human skulls and blood-stained altars. Shocked and terrified, Laura called her mother for help. As her mother rushed to her aid, Laura was confronted by Mr. Uche in the secret room. He admitted to his heinous deeds, revealing his sinister plan to sacrifice their unborn children for wealth and power. Overwhelmed by fear and despair, Laura cried out to God for deliverance. In a moment of divine intervention, a sudden knock on the door interrupted the chilling encounter. Mr. Uche fled to answer it, giving Laura the opportunity to break free and seek refuge with her mother. With the pastor's guidance, Mr. Uche repented of his sins and surrendered his life to Christ. In the aftermath of the ordeal, Laura made the courageous decision to leave her marriage behind and dedicate her life to serving God. Meanwhile, Mr. Uche faced the consequences of his actions, grappling with the weight of his sins and seeking redemption. With the truth revealed and God's grace shining upon them, Laura and her mother found solace and strength in each other's company. As they embraced, tears of relief and gratitude flowed freely, washing away the pain and fear that had plagued them for so long. Together, they sought refuge in the comforting embrace of their church community, where they found support and encouragement to face the challenges ahead. Through prayer and fellowship, Laura's faith grew stronger, filling her heart with hope for the future. Meanwhile, Mr. Uche faced the consequences of his actions, humbling himself before God and seeking forgiveness for his sins. With the guidance of the pastor and the love of his family, he embarked on a journey of redemption, determined to make amends for the harm he had caused. As the days turned into weeks, Laura found healing in the embrace of her loved ones and the comforting presence of God. With each passing day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and direction, embracing her role as a beacon of light and hope in a world shrouded in darkness. In time, Laura's story became a testament to the power of faith, forgiveness, and redemption. Through her testimony, others found courage to confront their own struggles and seek God's grace in their lives. As the sun set on their harrowing ordeal, Laura and her loved ones stepped into a new chapter of their lives, filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. With hearts full of gratitude and faith, they embraced the journey ahead, knowing that with God by their side, they could overcome any obstacle and find joy in the midst of their trials. And as they looked towards the horizon, a sense of peace washed over them, for they knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, guided by the unwavering love and grace of their Heavenly Father. So, my dear friends, remember that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. With faith, courage, and the love of God, we can overcome any challenge and find joy in the journey of life. In Laura's story, we learn a valuable lesson that echoes the age-old saying, "All that glitters are not gold," reminding us that appearances can be deceiving and not everyone who seems nice is truly kind-hearted, urging us to look beyond surface impressions and trust our instincts. For true goodness lies in actions, not just words, and it's essential to put God first in everything we do in life because He guides us with wisdom, love, and protection, helping us navigate through the challenges and uncertainties, providing us with strength, comfort, and guidance, and ultimately leading us to a path of righteousness and fulfillment, showing us that when we prioritize our faith and trust in God, we gain a steadfast anchor in the storms of life, a beacon of hope in times of darkness, and a source of unwavering love and grace that sustains us through every trial and triumph. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, share, like, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.